The night my husband left me to play with his nephew was one of the most thrilling nights of my life. It all happened a couple of weeks ago. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the city skyline. From the window of our house, I watched as the evening took over the hum of traffic below, mixing with the faint sounds of distant conversation. It was the kind of calm that normally brought me peace, but tonight, it left a weight in its place. Roberto, my husband, had left that very afternoon for a weekend work retreat. It wasn't the first time he had gone away for business, but his departure today felt different. Maybe it was the request he made when he kissed my cheek. "Goodbye, Greta," he said, lingering for a moment. "Keep an eye on Nicola while I'm gone. He's still figuring things out, and I don't want him to feel like a guest. Make him feel at home." Nicola, his 19-year-old nephew, had been staying with us for a couple of weeks. Fresh out of high school and preparing for university in the city, he had arrived at our doorstep with bags slung over his shoulders and an endearing mix of shyness and gratitude. Roberto had insisted we take him in for a while to help him settle. I didn't mind. Nicola was polite, respectful, and had a certain quiet charm that made him easy to be around. Still, the house felt different without Roberto. The dynamic between Nicola and me had always been cordial, but tonight, as the sky grew darker and the house settled into its usual nightly quietude, I felt a subtle change. Maybe it was the absence of Roberto's constant presence, or maybe it was something I couldn't explain. At 7 p.m., I heard the familiar creak of the stairs. Nicola appeared at the living room door, his dark hair slightly tousled, wearing a simple hoodie and jeans. He gave me a small smile, the kind that made him look younger than he was. "Hi, Aunt Greta," he greeted, his voice soft and warm. "Roberto told me you'd be here all weekend," he said. "Yes, I am," I replied, setting aside the book I hadn't really been reading. "I didn't want you to feel abandoned." He laughed, sitting down softly on the couch across from me. "He worries too much." "I'm fine." We fell into a comfortable silence. I couldn't help but notice the way he sprawled on the couch, his long legs stretched out and his posture relaxed. There was a calmness about him that night that I hadn't seen before. "Are you hungry?" I asked after a moment. "Yes, actually," he admitted, sitting up a little. "What's for dinner?" I got up and gestured for him to follow me to the kitchen. "Let's figure it out." We decided on something simple, pasta with a quick homemade sauce. Nicola offered to help, and together, we moved around the kitchen at a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. He chopped the vegetables with precision, his hands steady and sure, while I stirred the pot on the stove. The air between us was light, filled with the occasional joke or anecdote. "You were not bad at this," I said, watching him expertly dice a tomato. He smiled. "Neither are you." I laughed. "Well, don't get too cocky." When the food was ready, we sat down at the dining table. The soft glow of the overhead light cast a warm ambience. The conversation flowed naturally, his plans for university, his thoughts on the city, and some funny stories about Roberto from his childhood. He spoke with a quiet confidence that drew me in, and I found myself hanging on to every word. After dinner, we migrated back to the living room. Nicola took his usual spot on the couch, his body stretched out comfortably as if he owned the space. I returned to the armchair, but my gaze kept drifting back to him. There was a calmness about him that night, a confidence that felt new and intriguing. "Thanks for dinner," he said after a while, breaking the silence. "It was nice not having to do it all alone." "No problem," I replied softly. "I enjoyed it." There was another pause, this one heavier. Nicola's eyes met mine, and for a moment, it felt like the room had shrunk around us. The air was thick, charged with something unspoken but palpable. "I think I'll head to bed soon," he murmured, though he made no move to get up. "Okay," I said softly, my heart racing in my chest. He lingered a moment longer, his gaze sweeping over me in a way that seemed deliberate. Then, with a small smile, he stood up and stretched. "Good night, Aunt Greta." "Good night, Nicola." I watched him retreat up the stairs, the sound of his footsteps fading as he disappeared down the hallway. I sat there for a long time afterward, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Something had changed that night, though I couldn't put it into words. All I knew was that I wasn't ready for the night to end just yet. The house was silent now, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the wooden floors as the night settled in. I stayed in the living room for a while, watching the flickering light of the fireplace, my thoughts returning to Nicola. There was something about his demeanor that night, an energy I couldn't identify but also couldn't ignore. Finally, I made my way upstairs, my steps soft on the carpeted stairs. The hallway was dimly lit, only by the faint glow of the nightlight near the guest room. Nika's door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated as I passed by it. The sound of his soft breathing reached my ears. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind. This was ridiculous. I headed to my bedroom, closing the door behind me, but even as I changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed, my thoughts kept returning to him, his easy smile, the way his eyes lingered on mine just a second too long. I tossed and turned, looking up at the ceiling, my chest tight with a strange mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. Sleep wouldn't come. The quietude of the house felt oppressive, the silence loud in my ears. I wasn't sure what drove me, but after what felt like hours, I found myself slipping out of bed, my bare feet silent against the floor as I made my way down the hallway. My steps were guided by some unspoken pull. Nika's door was still slightly ajar, the faint light of his night lamp casting a soft glow into the hallway. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. "Nikola," I called softly, barely above a whisper. There was a rustle from inside, and then his voice, low and warm. "Yes?" I pushed the door open gently, stepping inside. He was sitting up in bed, the blankets around his waist, his dark hair tousled, his eyes heavy with sleep but alert. "I couldn't sleep," I admitted, standing awkwardly by the door. He smiled faintly, tilting his head slightly. Neither could I. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of the silence filling the space between us. Then, almost hesitantly, Nikola patted the empty space on the bed beside him. "Do you want to sit?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. I hesitated. Every rational part of me screamed that this was a bad idea. But there was something in his gaze, an openness, a quiet vulnerability that drew me in. I crossed the room and perched on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Is something on your mind?" he asked, his voice gentle but curious. I hesitated, not sure how to respond. "I don't know," I finally said. "I was just restless, I guess." He nodded, his gaze steady on mine. "Me too." I looked at him from the corner of my eye, my gaze fixed on the sharp angles of his jaw, the curve of his lips. He looked different in the soft light, softer, more vulnerable. "I'm glad you're here," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to him, frowning slightly. "You mean?" He shrugged and looked down at his hands. "I don't know. It's nice to have someone around. Someone who understands, I guess." I understood what he meant. "I see you," I said softly. The words slipped out before I could stop them. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched, and I looked at him, searching his face for any sign of what he was thinking. "Nikola," I began, my voice trembling slightly. But he shook his head, interrupting me. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I just need this. Even if it's only for a moment." I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, but when his fingers intertwined with mine, his touch warm and firm, I found myself leaning in. The world faded away as I surrendered to the moment. He met me halfway, our lips tentatively at first, a soft brush of skin against skin. But then the kiss deepened, the heat between us building with each passing second. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let my own hands find their way to his shoulders. It was wrong, I knew it. But in that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. His lips were warm against mine, soft but insistent. I felt his weight, the closeness, the undeniable pull that had been simmering beneath the surface all night. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and frantic in the silence of the room. "Nikola," I whispered against his mouth, not sure what I was trying to say. Was I asking him to stop or to continue? Even I didn't know. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he deepened the kiss, his hands gripping my waist with a firmness that sent a shiver down my spine. I found myself leaning into him, my body responding in ways that felt both strange and painfully familiar. He broke the kiss and rested his forehead against mine as we both tried to catch our breath. His eyes searched mine, dark and intense, as if trying to gauge what I was thinking. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though my mind was spinning. "Yes," I managed to say, though the word felt small and inadequate. He smiled faintly, his thumb gently brushing my cheek. "Good." For a moment, we sat there, the silence between us dense but not uncomfortable. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, the steady rhythm grounding me in a way I hadn't felt before. "This is crazy," I finally said, my voice trembling slightly. Nicola chuckled softly, his breath warm against my skin. "Yeah," he agreed, his tone light but serious. "But it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" I hesitated, the question hanging in the air between us. It felt wrong, my rational mind screamed. Yes, this was a line we never should have crossed. But my heart, my traitorous, aching heart, told a different story. "No," I admitted. The word slipped out before I could stop it. He smiled, a glimmer of something like hope in his eyes. "Then maybe it isn't." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this moment, this connection, was something pure and right. But fear and doubt lingered at the edges of my mind, threatening to pull me back to reality. "What if," I began, but the words caught in my throat. "What if this changes everything?" Nicola shook his head, his gaze firm. "It doesn't have to. We can take this one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations. Just this." He leaned in again, his lips brushing softly against mine, and I felt the tension in my chest ease a little. His hands moved to my back, pulling me closer, and I let him. My own hands tangled in his hair, the kiss deepening, the heat between us building once more. His touch was careful but insistent, his movements deliberate and unhurried. It was as if he was taking his time, savoring each moment, each sensation. I lost myself in him, in the warmth of his embrace, in the way he made me feel seen, understood, and wanted. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to simply feel. As the night stretched on, the boundaries between us blurred even more, the connection between us growing stronger with each passing moment. The world outside faded away, leaving just the two of us lost in the quiet intimacy of the night. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths heavy and our bodies pressed close, I looked at him, my heart full and heavy at the same time. "This is going to complicate things," I said softly, a slight smile tugging at my lips despite the weight of my words. Nicola smiled, his eyes gleaming with mischief and affection. "Probably." I nodded, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. "Yes," I said softly. "Me too, Nicola." He rested his head on my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the night outside and the occasional creak of the house settling. I wrapped an arm around him, pulling him closer, and he sighed contentedly. We stayed like that for a while, the silence between us filled with unspoken thoughts. I could feel the steady rhythm of his breath, comforting and grounding, and it gave me a moment to compose myself. My mind raced, replaying everything that had just happened, every touch, every glance, every whispered word. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing," Nicola said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. It was quiet but firm, mixed with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. I hesitated, my fingers tracing absent patterns on his back. "I don't either," I admitted softly. "But I don't know how we make this work." Nicola lifted his head to look at me, his eyes filled with a determination that took me by surprise. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just take it one day at a time." His words were reassuring, but the weight of the situation still lingered. The reality of what we had done, of what we were now to each other, was a lot to process. But at the same time, the idea of letting this go, of letting him go, was unbearable. "Okay," I finally said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "One day at a time." He smiled, leaning in to press a soft kiss on my forehead. "That's all we need." We stayed like that for a while longer, wrapped up in each other, the rest of the world forgotten. It felt safe, comforting, like we had found something we didn't even know we were looking for. Finally, the night began to catch up with us, the weight of exhaustion settling in. Nicola shifted, pulling away just enough to look at me. "We should probably get some sleep," he said, his voice tinged with reluctance. I nodded, though I didn't want to let go of him just yet. "Yes," I agreed, my own reluctance clear in my tone. But then he turned to look at me, his expression open and raw. "I don't want to let go," he admitted, his voice trembling with vulnerability. "I don't want this to end." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening at his words. Then don't, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Stay. He searched my face for a moment before leaning in, his hand finding mine and holding it tightly. Are you sure? He asked, his voice barely audible, as if afraid to break the fragile connection between us. I'm sure, I said, and I meant it. Without another word, he closed the distance between us, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative but mixed with an undeniable hunger. I responded instinctively, my hands finding their way to his face, pulling him closer. The world outside faded away as we lost ourselves in each other, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the room. Each touch, each kiss felt like a revelation, a deepening of the bond that had always been there but only now had come to light. It truly was one of the most thrilling nights of my life, and I didn't know what a young guy was capable of. Wow, his touches were so amazing, and every time I thought it was the last round, he was ready for another. We finally ended after 5 or 6 times. When we finished, Niko's hands slid down my arms, his touch sending shivers down my spine. I've wanted this for so long, he murmured against my lips, his voice laden with emotion. I just didn't know if you felt the same. I didn't realize it either, I admitted, my forehead resting against his. But now that I do, I don't want to stop. He smiled softly, his thumb brushing my cheek. Then we won't. The hours stretched on as we explored each other, discovering where we belonged. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, we were wrapped in each other's arms, our breaths slow and steady. Niko's head rested on my chest, and I ran my fingers through his hair, marveling at how good it felt. This changes everything, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, pressing a kiss to his forehead. I know. And I'm ready for it. We'll figure this out together. He smiled, his eyes meeting mine with a warmth that made my heart ache. I trust you, he said simply. And I trust you, I replied, my voice filled with conviction. As the night stretched on, we stayed there on the couch, wrapped in each other's warmth, unwilling to let the moment end. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we knew we would face them together, united by a love that had finally been set free. The next morning, I woke to the faint sound of birds outside the window and the soft creak of footsteps in the hallway. For a moment, I wasn't sure if the events of the previous night had been real or some vivid dream. But the lingering warmth in my chest told me it was real, every glance, every whispered word, every shared touch. I took a deep breath and got out of bed, slipping on a soft sweater as I made my way to the kitchen. Nikola was already there, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in his hands, his hair slightly disheveled, wearing an oversized hoodie that made him look younger and more vulnerable. When I entered, his face broke into a shy smile. Morning, he said, his voice soft but warm. Morning, I replied, my voice still groggy from sleep. I moved to pour myself a cup of coffee, the silence between us comfortable but charged. The weight of what we had shared hung in the air, unspoken but always present. Nikola leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my skin tingle. Are you okay? He asked, his voice laden with concern. I nodded, meeting his gaze. Yes, I'm okay. Are you? He hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yeah, he said, though there was a slight tremor in his voice. I just can't stop thinking about last night. I set my coffee down and moved closer to him, placing a hand on his arm. Neither can I admitted. But it's a lot to process. We need to take this slowly, figure out what this means for us. He nodded, his expression softening. I don't want to rush anything, he said. I just don't want to lose this. Lose you. You won't, I said, squeezing his arm firmly. We'll figure it out together. He smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Thank you, he said softly. We spent the rest of the morning in quiet companionship, sharing small smiles and touches as we went about our day. There was an unspoken understanding between us, an agreement to take things one step at a time. As the day wore on, I found myself watching Nikola more closely, noticing the way he moved, the way he smiled, the way his eyes lit up when he laughed. It was like seeing him in a new light, and it filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. By the time evening rolled around, we found ourselves back on the couch, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. Nikola sat close to me, his shoulder brushing against mine, and I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. Do you think this is crazy? He asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. What do you mean? He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the fire. This isn't exactly normal. I reached out, taking his hand in mine. Maybe it's not normal, I said. But it feels right, and that's what matters. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Do you really believe that? I do, I said firmly. As long as we're honest with each other, as long as we're careful, we can figure this out together. Nika's smile was small but genuine, and he squeezed my hand tightly. Thank you, he said. For not running. For giving this a chance. I couldn't run, even if I wanted to, I said with a playful smirk tugging at my lips. You were kind of hard to escape. He laughed, the sound light and genuine, and it filled me with a quiet joy. In that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. As the night wore on, we stayed like that, side by side, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and the comfort of each other's presence. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was ours. And I believe that was enough. I'm not sure if what I did was right. I still haven't told Roberto anything. Should I tell him? I don't know. I just don't know. And that was my story. If you liked it, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next stories. Goodbye for now.